In 2002, a quiet boarding school nestled in the Vermont woods reported the disappearance of a 16-year-old boy 14 hours after he vanished. His name was Thomas Rake. For nearly 2 decades, there were no answers. Then a cassette tape arrived at a small-town radio station. What it revealed would reopen old wounds, unravel buried secrets, and lead a desperate mother down a path darker than she ever imagined. The last snowfall of March 2002 fell heavy and silent over the quiet hills of Vermont. At St. Augustine Monastic Academy, a secluded boarding school run by the Brothers of the Immaculate Word, the long gray corridors and ancient oak doors muffled the wind outside. It was Holy Week, and the stone chapel bells had rung an hour earlier to mark Kapline. Inside the dormitory, most students were already in bed, their rooms darkened, the air tinged with the scent of old wood, laundry soap, and faint candle wax from the chapel. But Thomas Rake, a quiet, perceptive boy with a sharp jawline and heavily lidded eyes, hadn't returned to his room. He was 16, a junior known for his top grades in Latin and theology, and for asking questions that made some of the brothers uncomfortable. That night, at 8:45 p.m., he was last seen seated at the corner of the school's old library, reading alone. Brother Carmichael, the only staff member on duty in the library that evening, said Thomas seemed unusually focused, reading a leather-bound volume of pre-Vatican II doctrine that hadn't been checked out in years. Carmichael noted Thomas didn't look up when the bell rang to signal curfew. "Let the boy read," the monk had muttered to himself, locking the outer doors behind him shortly after. By morning, Thomas was gone. His roommate, Elijah Meeks, woke to an untouched bed and the slow realization that Thomas hadn't come in all night. At first, he assumed Thomas had fallen asleep in the library, a thing he'd done before. But when breakfast came and Thomas's place at the long oak table remained empty, murmurs began to ripple through the student body. Some whispered about Thomas sneaking off campus, others about detention. But Elijah knew better. The day before, Thomas had been in a heated exchange with Father Bell, one of the stricter faculty members. Thomas had pleaded for permission to leave early for Easter to visit his mother, who had recently undergone gallbladder surgery. Bell had refused, citing policy and discipline of spirit. That confrontation was never entered into official records. When Thomas was officially declared missing 14 hours later, administrators downplayed the situation. Father Bell informed police that Thomas had a history of skipping out for a few days when overwhelmed, something Thomas's mother would later strongly refute. "He's never done that," she told the press. "He always calls. He always lets me know." But the damage was done. The delay had compromised the first crucial hours of any missing persons case. Police dogs tracked a weak scent from the library to a narrow side exit leading to the forest path behind the dormitory. Snow had fallen heavily that night, and any footprints were lost, but one officer noted the back door's lock was faulty, something staff claimed they had already reported to maintenance. Inside the dorm, tension grew. Whispers turned into questions. The brothers insisted Thomas had probably gone to clear his head, maybe got lost in the woods, but Elijah found Thomas's wallet, watch, and inhaler still on his desk. He told the dorm supervisor, who nodded silently and wrote nothing down. 2 nights later, a search team was dispatched into the woods with flashlights and thermal drone. They found nothing. No shoe prints, no clothing, no sign of struggle, just acres of thick pine forest and brittle ice. Within the week, a new theory quietly surfaced among the older students that Thomas had been caught sneaking out and something had gone wrong. Elijah overheard one senior say, "If you piss off the wrong brother, you don't just get disappeared." It was brushed off as cruel teen bravado. Still, it lingered. 10 days after the disappearance, Brother Carmichael was placed on temporary leave, citing health reasons. Father Bell continued teaching. On the 15th day, St. Augustine issued a formal press release. "We mourn the unexplained absence of our student Thomas Rake and are cooperating fully with local authorities in the ongoing investigation. We ask the media and public to respect our institution's privacy during this difficult time." But Elijah never forgot what he saw the night before Thomas vanished. A blackened bruise on his friend's right wrist, half covered by the sleeve of his blazer. When asked, Thomas had brushed it off. "Bell grabbed me harder than he meant to," he whispered. And no one talked about that again. By the time Officer Dean Wilcox arrived at the gates of St. Augustine Monastic Academy, the sun had already begun to fade behind the bare maples lining the rural access road. The academy's stone facade loomed still and solemn, its stained glass windows flickering with late afternoon light. Inside, the mood was tense but eerily organized. No alarms, no lockdowns, just muted conversation and the distinct absence of urgency. It was 3:27 p.m., nearly 15 hours since Thomas Rake had last been seen. Dean noted this almost immediately in his field log, underlining the time delay twice. "You waited until now?" he asked the head administrator, Father Malley, a heavy-set man with spectacles that sat crooked on his nose. Malley shrugged. "Thomas has disappeared before, never for long. We thought he'd turn up after morning prayer." Dean had seen this before. Institutions that shielded their own, slow to act for fear of scandal. "Is that documented?" he asked, pen poised. "Previous disappearances?" Mallet hesitated. "I'm not sure. Perhaps the Dean of Students kept records, but I assure you it's not abnormal for boys his age to wander off during times of spiritual strain." That phrase stuck with Dean, who was no stranger to religious language, but found little comfort in it now. The moment Thomas's mother arrived, Veronica Rake, sharp-eyed and visibly shaking, it became clear that something didn't align. "You would never just leave," she insisted, gripping a photo of her son in a summer camp t-shirt. "Not without his inhaler, not without his jacket. This doesn't make sense." Dean listened carefully, noting that she had already called local hospitals, bus stations, and even the Red Cross. "If he left on his own," she said, voice rising, "why hasn't anyone seen him?" The school had no answer. By 5:00 p.m., Dean requested to search the dormitory. He started in Thomas's room. Everything was neatly arranged, bed made, desk cleared, notebooks stacked, but the air felt wrong, lived in but frozen. On the desk sat Thomas's watch, wallet, and a folded piece of paper containing a verse from Psalms. "The night is long and I see no light," it read. There was no indication who had written it. Elijah, his roommate, hovered nearby. "That wasn't there before," he said quietly. Dean believed him. He moved on to the library and classrooms, checking window latches, door hinges. It wasn't until he reached the east wing that he found something troubling. The stairwell leading down to the maintenance basement had a draft. When he descended the narrow stone steps, flashlight in hand, he noticed the metal-framed window near the furnace room was unlocked, slightly ajar. The snow from the previous night had drifted inside, wetting the concrete. On the ledge, smudged in the frost, was a partial handprint. Outside, Dean followed the trail, small, faint impressions leading down the slope behind the chapel. The snow was patchy, crusted with ice. A few prints were visible, but quickly dissolved into broken branches and untouched whiteness. Then, nothing. Back at the station, Dean filed a missing persons report and flagged the case for state-level involvement. He requested Thomas's school records and discipline file. Within a day, he received a manila folder that was conspicuously thin. Attendance logs, a transcript, and one counseling note from 6 months prior regarding trouble adjusting to community prayer expectations. No mention of behavior issues, no prior disappearances. It contradicted what Malley had told him. Dean called Veronica. She confirmed her son had no history of running away. "He's meticulous," she said. "He's always home for the holidays. He calls me every Sunday after Vespers. Always. He'd never go without telling me." On April 1st, the local search was expanded. Volunteers combed the forest behind the academy. A state police canine unit was brought in. The dogs picked up a scent along the ridge, but lost it near the creek bed 2 miles east. Snowmelt had risen fast in the past few days, possibly washing away traces. Helicopters scanned the terrain from above, but to no avail. Dean revisited the school, requesting to interview staff. Most offered polite, careful statements. One lay brother, 30-something and soft-spoken, mentioned that Thomas had once asked to see the archived building maps. "He said something about unused tunnels," the man recalled. "I thought he was being dramatic. That detail wasn't in any report." In the following days, the brothers seemed increasingly reluctant to cooperate. Father Bell, when finally approached, claimed he barely knew the boy. "Bright student, quiet, nothing unusual," he said flatly. Dean didn't press, not yet, but noted the way Bell had shifted in his chair when asked if Thomas had ever challenged his authority. Dean started to hear murmurs. Former students contacted through a quiet alumni network shared a different picture of a place where silence was preferred, where reprimands were private and rarely recorded. One even described being made to scrub chapel floors overnight as punishment for questioning a priest's lesson. Dean asked Veronica if Thomas had ever mentioned anything about the staff. She hesitated. "He said some brothers were strict," she said, "but he never wanted to worry me. He just said the school wasn't what he thought it would be." By mid-April, national media briefly picked up the story. Headlines asked why a prestigious academy had waited so long to report a missing student. The academy released a new statement, reiterating that they believed Thomas had left of his own volition and that they were praying for his safe return. Dean watched the clip on the evening news, jaw clenched. He knew what the subtext meant. Let this blow over. But he wasn't ready to let go. Then, on April 19th, a groundskeeper named Eugene Pally contacted Dean with something odd. He had been clearing brush near the tool shed when he noticed an old crawlspace entrance partially covered by a tarp. "I thought it was sealed years ago," he said. Inside, they found nothing, just dirt and brick damp with snowmelt. But near the edge, tucked behind a rusted pipe, was a torn piece of fabric, gray, with a pattern. Veronica confirmed it was from a scarf Thomas wore in winter, knitted by her mother. Dean sent it for forensic testing. Back at the station, Dean reviewed school CCTV from the hallway leading to the library. Most footage had been erased after 24 hours, per the academy's policy, but one grainy frame, barely visible, showed a figure in dark clothing standing outside the library door at 8:50 p.m., less than 5 minutes after Thomas was last seen. No timestamp, no audio. The academy claimed it was probably a glitch. Dean didn't believe that, and neither did Elijah, who, when asked again about that night, said something he hadn't before. "I thought I heard a door close," he said. "Not the hallway, something below us, like a metal." Dean returned to the basement window. It had been relocked, but the inside latch had fresh scratches, as though recently forced back into place. On the 15th day following Thomas Rake's disappearance, the atmosphere at St. Augustina shifted. The search crews were gone, the media had moved on, and the forest trail behind the academy was left to silence and melting snow. Inside the school, however, something else changed. On a Wednesday morning, just before the students were due in chapel, Father Bell failed to appear for his first-period theology class. By lunch, murmurs spread that he had left campus the previous night. By dinner, his name was removed from the classroom door. Father Malley addressed the staff privately, explaining that Bell had taken an indefinite leave for personal reasons, but the truth was more abrupt. Bell had resigned in a 2-sentence email sent at 2:04 a.m. the night prior. No forwarding address, no return contact. The message simply read, "I will not be returning. Please ensure my office is cleared promptly." Officer Dean Wilcox was notified by an anonymous faculty member who found the resignation odd, especially given Bell's former rigidity. The timing, coming just as Dean began re-interviewing staff with renewed pressure from state investigators, was too clean. Dean arrived that afternoon and asked to examine Bell's office before it was emptied. He was met with resistance. "It's already been packed up," said the administrative secretary. As per Father Malaghy's instructions, Dean requested access to the boxes. After a long pause and a tense phone call between the secretary and the head, a key was handed over. Bell's office was on the 3rd floor, in the old wing that overlooked the back of the property. The room was cold, austere, no photos, no personal touches, just a desk, bookshelves, and a metal file cabinet. Dean opened each drawer methodically. There were lesson plans, student grading sheets, and a dozen printouts of scripture analysis articles. Nothing unusual. Until the bottom drawer. In it, under a stack of outdated syllabi, Dean found a black folder labeled Classroom Notes, Confidential. Inside were copies of student writings and journaling assignments, many of them theological reflections. One stood out. A single sheet, scanned and reprinted, with faint bloom text, read simply, "I'm tired of being told to keep secrets. If God is truth, then why are the lies always protected? Why is silence rewarded?" Dean stared at the page. The tone was unmistakably Thomas's. The lines weren't dramatic, but there was weight in them, frustration beneath composure. No grade, no feedback was marked on the page. Why Bell had this in a confidential folder was unclear. When Dean inquired about the original copy, the administration claimed not to know anything about the reflection assignment. "It must have been an optional class activity," Malley said, avoiding eye contact. "Father Bell handled his own curriculum. Some of the brothers did that." Dean didn't believe him. He took the photocopy back to the station and filed it under evidence. That night, he called Veronica Rake. He read the words to her over the phone. She didn't speak for several seconds. Then, voice trembling, she asked, "Do you think he was being silenced?" Dean didn't answer. The next day, Dean submitted a subpoena request for Bell's employment and contact history. The diocese compliance office replied with a brief fax. Bell had been transferred before, twice, each time after less than 3 years at a given school. No complaints were ever formally recorded, but one note from 1997 in Ohio read, the vague wording set off alarm bells. Dean sent an urgent request to track Bell's vehicle registration and recent credit card activity. But the DMV reported his sedan had been sold 3 days ago to an unverified cash buyer. The credit card linked to Bell's name hadn't used in over a week. Meanwhile, Elijah Meeks, Thomas's former roommate, returned to the station voluntarily. "There's something I didn't say," he confessed, hands shaking slightly. "The night Thomas went missing, he had this small notebook he never let anyone touch. I saw him writing in it that afternoon. Later, it was gone from his drawer. I thought he took it with him, but now I wonder if someone else took it." Dean asked if the notebook had ever been found. Elijah shook his head. "I searched the room, even under the mattress. Nothing." Dean filed this as a possible stolen personal item. He returned to the academy one more time that week, asking to examine storage rooms where old student records or confiscated items might be kept. He was granted access to the basement archive, an unlit, musty space filled with metal cabinets and decades of dust. In one cabinet labeled Miss Suit's Cool Assessment and a CDRES, inside were 3 books, 2 school essays, and a CD play of Doug Lineberg, a provocateur. He took the items for further analysis. The essays were standard. The books bore no notes, but the CD-ROM, once inserted into a secured police system, revealed something unexpected: login access to an internal messaging system used by faculty to monitor student searches and messages on the school library computers. According to the metadata, Thomas had searched terms like manager confession and legal boundaries. In teachers, student confidentiality rights, and how to report clergy misconduct anonymously. This shifted the tone of the investigation. Dean suspected Thomas had been trying to report something, possibly someone, and that Father Bell may have known. With no leads on Bell's current location, Dean contacted former students again. One young man, now 24, said something haunting. He used to quote scripture as punishment. "He made me rewrite Proverbs 12 over and over. The one who conceals hatred has lying lips. Over and over until my hands cramped. I was 13. Dean asked if the student had ever reported it. "I tried," the man said, "but who was going to believe me? Bell was untouchable." Another student, now a youth minister in Buffalo, said Bell had interrogated him about impure thoughts during a one-on-one confession and insisted he return for follow-up meetings, which eventually stopped without explanation. Dean included all of this in the now growing profile being compiled by the State Bureau. Back in Vermont, as spring began to thaw the last of the snow, a package arrived at the police station addressed simply to Detective Rake Case. Inside was a cassette tape, unmarked. Dean played it alone in the conference room. A boy's voice came through, whispering prayer lines, fractured and barely audible. Between Latin verses, one phrase stood out in English, repeated twice. "He told me I had to. He said God forgives everything, but only if I obey." Dean froze. The voice, weak but recognizable, bore chilling similarity to Thomas's recordings from a school Christmas program the year before. In early July of 2002, with summer break in effect and the campus of St. Augustine unusually silent, a formal letter was issued by the diocese. Father Raymond Malley, longtime head of the monastic academy, was stepping down effective immediately due to urgent health concerns. The statement was brief, clinical, and circulated only among faculty and board members. To the broader public, the transition was painted as routine. But for Officer Dean Wilcox, who had been monitoring the school's movements closely, the timing was suspect. Just days earlier, he had sent a follow-up request for additional documentation related to student discipline, specifically any reports involving Thomas Rake and potential infractions tied to school curfews. His request had gone unanswered. When he called to follow up, the line transferred him to a new acting administrator, Father Marcus Tierney, a younger, more polished voice who claimed the academy was in the process of organizing older archives due to the recent leadership change. Dean had heard that phrase before. It always meant the same thing: delay. Within the week, Dean paid an unannounced visit to the academy. Tierney greeted him politely in the office, once occupied by Mally, offering tea and speaking in rehearsed tones about institutional transparency. When Dean inquired directly about Mally's health, Tierney simply said, "He's resting at the Monastery Retreat Center upstate." The stress of leadership wore him thin. Later that afternoon, he submitted a formal medical inquiry to the nearest affiliated hospital. The response came within 24 hours. Father Mally had not been admitted under his own name, nor had he received any recent treatment that would explain a medical retirement. Dean then contacted the insurance provider listed on the diocese personnel file. The last health claim submitted under Mally's name had been a routine dental cleaning in February. Back at the academy, Dean met with Karen Holloway, a part-time administrative assistant who had worked in the main office for 8 years. She was hesitant at first, but eventually agreed to speak off the record. "Mally wasn't sick," she said. "He was spooked. I don't know what exactly happened, but after the police came asking about that boy, his whole demeanor changed. One day he was reading out loud from Augustine's Confessions in morning briefing, and the next, he was pale, not sleeping, barely talking. Then he cleared out." Karen also admitted that the discipline logs from the previous school year, specifically 20012002, were now missing from the filing cabinets. "He used to be kept in the back room," she whispered. "Physical binders. Now they're just gone." Dean returned to that back room the following day, insisting on a complete inventory. The maintenance clerk assisting him reported that a janitorial disposal had taken place 3 weeks earlier, removing damaged or obsolete files due to a rodent infestation. No damage report had been filed, no photos were taken. When Dean requested a list of what was thrown out, the clerk gestured vaguely to a bin outside the chapel, now empty. "Told us to burn what smelled like mold," the man said. "I don't remember reading the folders, we just followed orders." Suspicious that important documents were being systematically destroyed, Dean pulled a copy of the Academy's storage protocol from their internal policy handbook, which required log entries for any file disposal related to student records. No such entries had been made. That afternoon, he called the local fire marshal and requested confirmation of any approved controlled burns on school property within the past 30 days. None were registered. Whatever had been removed, it had been done off the books. The missing records became more concerning when Dean reached out to 2 former students who had lived in Thomas's dorm during the 20012002 school year. One, now attending college in Boston, recalled an incident in which he and Thomas had been reprimanded for leaving their room after lights out. "We weren't doing anything bad," he explained, sneaking down to the common room to get some leftover cake from a birthday party. "Belle caught us. Said we were defying the sanctity of silence. We had to clean the bathrooms for a week." When Dean asked if a formal write-up had occurred, the student said yes. He even remembered being asked to sign a form. That form no longer existed in the school's disciplinary archive. A second student, who had since moved to Oregon, recounted a similar event. He, Thomas, and another boy named Luca had been found talking after curfew and forced to sleep in separate cells in the old monastery wing for 2 nights as reflection time. "It was weird," the former student said. "Lights, no windows, just a cot and a candle. Like solitary. I remember Thomas saying he couldn't sleep because he kept hearing footsteps in the hallway, even when no one else was supposed to be down there." When Dean asked if he'd told anyone, the student laughed bitterly. "Who was I going to tell? Mally? Belle? They were the ones who sent us down there." Compounding the issue, an anonymous letter was received at the sheriff's office containing a printed photo of an old whiteboard schedule labeled Student Reflections, March 2002. Thomas's name was written in red, circled, and dated the week before his disappearances. Other names had been erased with marker, but were still faintly visible when Dean enhanced the photo digitally. One of them was Luca ID, confirmed through yearbook records, but Luca was not traceable. A quick check revealed his family had moved to Italy the summer after Thomas vanished. No forwarding address had been provided. Dean began to suspect a larger pattern, one that involved not just Father Bell, but systemic failure or concealment by senior figures at the academy. He requested subpoena authority to gain access to internal communications among staff during the 2002 school year, but the school's email server, maintained off-site by the Diocese's network, had already been partially purged in what they claimed was a routine data hygiene protocol. Dean managed to retrieve only a partial archive. Among the remaining fragments, one brief exchange stood out. An email from Father Bell to Mally, dated March 27, 2002, read, "TR continues to push boundaries. I suggest a formal intervention before he escalates further." Mally's reply simply read, "Do what you must, just no more written reports. We can't afford visibility." Dean printed the thread and highlighted every word. No more written reports. We can't afford visibility. This was not discipline. It was cover-up. Back at the office, Veronica Rake visited unexpectedly. She had received a strange phone call the night before, no caller ID, just static, then a soft male voice whispering the words, "They know." It lasted only seconds. Dean had the line traced, but it bounced through a series of prepaid burner numbers registered out of state. He asked Veronica if she recognized the voice. She couldn't say for sure. "But it sounded young," she said, "not like a grown man." Dean looked back at the cassette they had received earlier. The voice was similarly faint, broken by static, filled with dread. On a humid Monday morning in June 2021, at exactly 8:02 a.m., a small padded envelope arrived at WNVR Radio, a local news and commentary station serving the greater Burlington area. The envelope bore no return address. Its only markings were a smudged postmark from Missouri and a handwritten label in black letters. So inside was an old-school audio cassette, the kind they hadn't used in over a decade. She held it up, shrugged, and handed it to Lou Masters, the station's veteran host. "Looks like a prank," she said, but Lou, who had worked radio since the ADS and had seen more than his share of strange mail, raised an eyebrow. Something about the label unsettled him, not its content, but the slanted pressure behind each letter, as if written in urgency. Lou found an old tape deck in the storage closet, blew off the dust, and slid the cassette in. At first, static. Then, faint rustling, like fabric shifting or someone adjusting a microphone. Then came a voice. A boy's voice, young but shaky, as though reciting something under duress. "Pater Noster, quies in caelus, sanctificus nomen tuum," the Lord's Prayer in Latin. The voice faltered midway. "Forgive me. I didn't mean to see it." "Pater Noster, quies in caelus," each square inch. There was a long pause, followed by what sounded like a distant door creaking. Then silence. The entire recording lasted 2 minutes and 43 seconds. Lou rewound it and played it again. The voice sent chills down his spine, not because of what it said, but because it felt real, raw, desperate. Later that morning, Lou called Dean Wilcox, now retired but still consulting with local law enforcement on cold cases. "Dean," Lou said, voice low, "I think I have something connected to the Rake case." Dean drove to the station that afternoon. They played the tape 3 times. On the third listen, Dean leaned forward, his jaw clenched. The postmark read, Osceola MO 656. The number was partially faded, but Dean recognized the town. Osceola was once home to St. Michael's Reclamation Camp, a now-defunct Catholic-run facility for wayward boys, closed in 2015 following multiple abuse allegations. Dean remembered the headlines but hadn't made the connection to Thomas's case. Until now. Back at his office, Dean had the audio digitized and ran a spectral voice comparison using Thomas's last known recording, a school choir performance from December 2001. The preliminary result was striking, a 92% match, even accounting for age of activist and Boston, who confirmed a likely identity match within acceptable forensic parameters. He then contacted Veronica Rake. She came in the next morning, nervous, clutching a framed photo of Thomas at age 16. Dean played her the recording in private. The moment the voice whispered, "Forgive me," her eyes filled with tears. "That's him," she said. "That's my son." Dean requested federal assistance to track the mailing origin. The cassette had been dropped off at a rural slot according to the clerk's log, dated June 11. Surveillance footage showed only a blurry figure in a hoodie and ball cap, no facial details. The mailing label had been printed at home, cut unevenly with scissors and taped with generic scotch. Fingerprints were smudged beyond recovery. Digging deeper, Dean investigated the old St. Michael's camp. Though shuttered, the grounds remained under church ownership, locked and overgrown. He contacted the diocese in Kansas City, requesting access. After several days of bureaucratic resistance, they agreed to let him visit with a chaperone. The facility was eerie, peeling paint, rusted beds, and decaying scripture verses still painted above doorways. The chapel was sealed, the windows boarded. In one room labeled Reflection Hall, Dean found an old metal locker. Inside was a mailed-you notebook labeled TR. Most pages were ruined, but one remained legible, a single sentence, written over and over, "You must not speak." A waitress in her 50s leaned in and said, "We used to see boys being brought in vans, all quiet. Some never left. Everyone knew, but no one said anything." Dean asked if anyone remembered a boy named Thomas Rake. She shook her head. "They didn't use real names there," she said, "gave them new ones." Back at the station, Dean received a call from an old contact at the Department of Social Services. "I saw your inquiry," the voice said. "We had a teen in Missouri around 6, no ID, refused to speak, matched the age range. Went by Tim Ralke. Could be a coincidence, but it's damn close." Dean requested the intake records. The file, sparse and handwritten, showed a boy with similar physical characteristics. He had been admitted to a shelter for runaways in Springfield, Missouri, stayed for 41 days, and vanished overnight. No forwarding address, no follow-up. Dean began building a timeline. Thomas vanishes in 2002. In 2006, a mute teen with a nearly identical name appears briefly in the system. A defunct Catholic reform camp in Missouri might have housed him. Now, nearly 20 years later, a tape with his possible voice is mailed from that same region. Dean shared this with Veronica. She stared at the evidence board in silence, then said softly, "He was trying to reach me, even now." Dean submitted the cassette for voice stress analysis. The result suggested elevated cortisol markers in the boy's voice, indicators of fear, exhaustion, or trauma. The phrasing, particularly, "I didn't mean to see it," haunted Dean. Why was he made to recite prayer? Who recorded him? The age of the cassette, confirmed by magnetic degradation patterns, suggested it had been made in the early 2000s, not recently, which meant someone had been holding onto it for nearly 2 decades before sending it. More disturbing still, a sound engineer reviewing the background audio isolated a faint metallic clank, repeated, rhythmic. After enhancement, they matched it to the locking mechanism used in institutional cell doors, particularly those common in correctional religious facilities during the late 90s. Dean felt a knot forming in his stomach. This wasn't a boy praying freely. This was a boy being made to perform something, possibly recorded without his knowledge, possibly as leverage, or as evidence. Then, just before midnight that same week, a second envelope arrived at WNVR. 3 days after the second envelope arrived at WNVR, containing nothing more than a second identical cassette marked "Do Not Forget," the FBI formally reopened the Thomas Rake investigations as a cold case. With new active leads, the agency assigned Special Agent Lynn Braddock, a seasoned operator with experience in religious abuse investigations and child trafficking cases. She flew into Vermont within 48 hours and requested immediate access to all audio evidence collected by Dean Wilcox and his department. After a preliminary review, Agent Braddock directed her attention to the cassette recording's voice, citing the urgent need for forensic comparison with known audio samples from Thomas's time at St. Augustine. Dean provided a digitized copy of the 2001 Christmas Mass recording in which Thomas had recited scripture as part of a student liturgy. The recording, archived by the school's AV club, was grainy but usable. The FBI lab team conducted a layered spectrographic analysis, comparing the tonal patterns, stress articulation, vowel resonance, and ambient breath spacing between the two recordings. The report, delivered 2 weeks later, stunned even the most skeptical voices. A 98.2% probability match, concluding with high confidence that the voice on the Missouri cassette was that of Thomas Rake, aged 16, or recorded within a year of his disappearances. The result exploded through both local and national channels. The Rake case, long relegated to dusty backrooms and faded clippings, surged into headlines. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, there was not just hope, but evidence. The FBI issued a formal request for re-entry into the archives of St. Augustine Monastic Academy. Under pressure from both federal mandate and public scrutiny, the Academy agreed to cooperate. Dean, brought back as a liaison, accompanied Agent Braddock and a forensic archivist team into the school's basement level, where decades of records were stacked in haphazard metal cabinets and cardboard boxes. The air was thick with mildew, the overhead fluorescents buzzed faintly, and many files had clearly been untouched for years. They began systematically opening and cataloging boxes from the 2001 to 2000 school year. In one rust-colored cabinet, buried beneath altar linen inventories and expired maintenance contracts, the team discovered a box labeled Senior Class Photos and Event Prints. Inside were dozens of snapshots, school plays, group outings, prayer services. Most were benign, but one, tucked at the bottom in a yellow geologic envelope, immediately drew Braddock's eye. It was the official class photo of 2001. 24 students, 8 faculty, arranged in 2 neat rows on the front steps of the chapel. All faces visible, all except one. Someone had taken a piece of black electrical tape and placed it carefully, deliberately, over the face of Father Thomas Bell. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't damage. The tape was cleanly cut and pressed flat. As if with surgical precision, Braddock removed it with tweezers, noting the subtle imprint of the tape's adhesive left behind on the glossy surface. The underlying face was visible, Bell's stern expression, square glasses, pressed clerical collar. But the act of obscuring it had symbolic weight. Someone wanted him erased, silenced, removed from memory without destroying the artifact itself. Dean scanned the back of the photo. In faded ink, someone had written, Easter term, May 2001. This was the last good year. No signature. They found the student roster from that same year. A red pen had scratched out 3 names, Thomas Rake, Luca Ferrano, and Elijah Meeks. Only Elijah had remained at the school into graduation. The others, Thomas disappeared, Luca transferred out within months. Their files, curiously, were thinner than average. Elijah's, by contrast, had annotations in different handwriting styles, including notes like, watched closely, emotionally unstable, and one cryptic line, may require containment. Agent Braddock requested a direct interview with Elijah, now in his mid-30s and living out of state. He agreed to speak under condition of anonymity. During the interview, he confessed that after Thomas vanished, there was a brief period of fear among the students. We weren't just scared he was missing, Elijah said. We were scared we'd be next. He recalled that shortly after Bell left, the brothers held a week-long silent retreat, during which no questions about Thomas were permitted. If you even mentioned his name, Elijah explained, you'd be assigned extra reflection hours in the old wing. Meanwhile, the forensic team discovered that one of the Academy's old storage closets had been converted, sometime in the early 2000s, into an unregistered document room. Behind layers of hymnals and liturgical calendars, they found a locked drawer built into the wall. With permission from the Academy's legal counsel, Braddock ordered it opened. Inside were 6 VHS tapes, unlabeled except for numeric codes. Each was dated between 1999 and 2002. They were handed over to the FBI's Digital Forensics Unit. One tape in particular, marked 7APR 2002, appeared to be raw security footage from a hallway near the East Chapel wing. Though grainy, it clearly showed a young boy, matching Thomas's build, standing outside Father Bell's office late at night, pacing nervously. A second figure, taller, dressed in robes, emerged from the shadows and seemed to guide him inside. The timestamp was 2 days before Thomas was declared missing. Dean watched the footage twice. The posture of the boy, the hesitation, the reluctant obedience. It matched what Veronica once said, "Thomas didn't fight authority, but he never stopped questioning it." Braddock sent the video stills to Veronica. She responded with a single message, "That's him. That's my son." The reopened case now included potential evidence of unlawful detainment, systemic suppression, and possible transport of a minor across state lines. A new name surfaced in archived employment records, Father Andrew Castor, listed as a visiting theology instructor in spring 2002, but with no prior or subsequent affiliation with the diocese. His address led to a mailbox rental in upstate New York. When the FBI tried to contact him, the rental had been closed for over 15 years. Dean remembered something else. In one of the last interviews he conducted before retiring, a former janitor had mentioned a secret project led by Father Bell and another tall one with the voice of a smoker. The janitor had thought they were converting part of the chapel basement. No such renovations were ever logged. Braddock requested blueprints of the original monastery buildings. Hidden between the 1957 and 1965 expansion layers was a chamber labeled Holding Restricted Use. No official record of its decommissioning existed. Following the public release of the FBI's confirmation that the voice on the mysterious cassette was likely that of Thomas Rake, media interest surged again in the decades-old case. Among the journalists drawn to the story was Miriam Doyle, a seasoned freelance investigative reporter known for her persistence and reputation for digging into forgotten corners. Miriam had been following the Thomas Rake case since the first articles resurfaced in 2021, and she'd grown particularly interested in the Missouri connection, specifically the cassette's postmark from the small town of Osceola and its proximity to the defunct St. Michael's reclamation camp. Understood leads the authorities might not have the bandwidth to chase, Miriam flew into Kansas City, rented a car, and drove 3 hours south into the rolling countryside where Osceola sat tucked away, dusty, and largely forgotten. Her first stop was the Osceola Post Office, a squat red brick building that hadn't been remodeled since the 70s. She spoke with the clerk who had been on duty the day the cassette was mailed. He recalled nothing unusual, just a stack of envelopes dropped in the overnight slot, as usual. No one ever stood out. But when Miriam mentioned St. Michael's, his expression changed slightly. "That place has been closed a long time," he said. "People don't talk about it much around here. Used to be a few miles out, near where that old nursing home is, all abandoned now." Miriam's interest piqued. She checked county records and found that, in its last listed state, been repurposed briefly as a nursing home before closing in 2017. Its official use prior to 2010 was redacted in the public documents, but local rumor and several archived news clippings confirmed it had been a Catholic juvenile rehabilitation facility from the 1980s through 2015. The next morning, Miriam drove to the location. The road was cracked, barely paved, and choked with overgrowth. The building, a low rectangular complex of cinder block and boarded-up windows, stood surrounded by fields of tall grass and the skeletal remains of old playground equipment. She parked at the edge and stepped out cautiously, camera and recorder in hand. The front doors had been chained, but a side window was already broken, its frame bent just wide enough to slip through. Inside, the air was stale, smelling of mold and disuse. Faded signage still labeled rooms as Reflection 1, Dormitory B, and Chapel Annex. Her footsteps echoed down the halls, and fragments of old student graffiti peeked through peeling paint. Quotes from Psalms, names scratched with pens, and a chilling phrase stenciled repeatedly. In the back office, behind a warped metal filing cabinet, Miriam discovered an unsecured maintenance door leading to a storage basement. With her flashlight, she navigated the cluttered space filled with broken furniture and boxes. One box, water-stained but mostly intact, was labeled Admit, Records 20006. She opened it and began flipping through intake forms, mostly paper files, in manila folders. Halfway through the stack, she found it. The folder was marked Ralke, T-I-M. Her breath caught. Inside, the first page was a standard admission form from 2004. The name was listed as Timothy Rake, age 18, with a birth date of March 28, 1986, identical to Thomas Rake's. Further down, the intake nurse had noted no known allergies, asthma history, mother deceased, further unknown, blood type, O-Agon S Club. That too matched the original medical file from Vermont. Miriam took photos of every page. The next document was a psychological intake note describing resistance to authority, uncooperative silence, night terrors, and obsessive whispering of scripture. The staff suspected the boy had experienced prior trauma, but noted he was unwilling to speak of his past. Another page contained a progress report from December 2004. Subject has shown moderate behavioral compliance, still refuses to acknowledge birth name, answers only to T, shows improvement in routine adherence, but remains emotionally flat, does not engage in peer interaction, suggest weekly confession, continuing. It was signed by a Frank Andrew C. That name jumped out, Father Andrew Castor, previously listed as a temporary faculty member at St. Augustine the year Thomas vanished, the same man whose paper trail evaporated after 2002. Miriam kept going. The last entry in the file was dated February 2005. Subject failed to return from scheduled work duty in outer field. Search conducted, no sign. Possible absconsion, facility protocol followed, no police report filed. In the margin, someone had scrawled, "Runaways don't call home." She paused, heart racing. There it was. A boy, same birth date, same blood type, matching description, with a modified name that could easily have been an alias or clerical manipulation. And then he was gone. Again, she photographed the entire file, closed the box, and exited the facility. Back at her motel, she cross-referenced names in the file with archived parish records from the Kansas City Diocese. Father Andrew Castor had been assigned to a youth outreach mission in Missouri to 2003 to 2006, after which there was no further trace. He was not listed in any published clergy directories after that year. She then emailed the scanned documents to Agent Braddock with a brief message. "You need to see this." Braddock called within hours. "This changes everything," she said. She requested Miriam's permission to cite the documents in the ongoing federal investigation. Miriam agreed but insisted on going public once validation was complete. By week's end, the FBI had confirmed that the intake form for Tim Rake bore the same Social Security number previously assigned to Thomas Rake, though the last digit had been altered in ink. Handwriting analysis suggested the change was deliberate. Braddock shared the finding with Veronica Rake. The news devastated and renewed her. "He was there," she whispered. "They hid him in plain sight." Meanwhile, Dean Wilcox began working with Braddock to build a map of institutional transfers across Catholic-run facilities between 2002 and 2006. Patterns emerged. Boys reported as runaways from one center often reappeared months later in another under altered names. Thomas's case, once isolated, now hinted at something systemic. Miriam, meanwhile, prepared her story for publication, unsure if anyone would believe the full weight of what she had found. 2 weeks after Miriam Doyle's report surfaced online, its reach extended far beyond what she had anticipated. The detailed article, complete with photos of the Tim Rake file, the abandoned reform facility, and quotes from local sources, reignited national attention. Former students of similar Catholic institutions began sharing their own stories, and the case of Thomas Rake, once cold, had become a point of reckoning. Among those reading was Helen Cartwright, a retired social worker living just outside Springfield, Missouri. She had worked in youth placement programs for over 20 years and was now in her 70s. But when she saw the name, Kalki, something stirred. Not just the name, but the face. The vacant, guarded expression in the 2004 intake photo mirrored one she had encountered years before. A boy she had tried, unsuccessfully, to help. Helen contacted the FBI tip line. She was patched to Agent Braddock within hours. "I don't know if this means anything," Helen began, "but I worked with a team in 2006. He never spoke, barely responded to touch. We suspected extreme trauma. His intake name was different, Travis R., but when I asked where he was from, the only word he ever whispered was Vermont." Braddock scheduled an in-person interview the next morning. Helen met Braddock at a federal field office in Jefferson City. She brought her old notebook, a dog-eared, leather-bound journal she had kept personally during her last few years on the job. In it, under an entry dated April 1st in April 2006, she had written, Travis R., up 19Y/O, thin build, quiet, eyes downcast. Reported by shelter staff to have been picked up sleeping behind bus terminal. No ID, scar on left wrist, no history found, one word offered in interview, Vermont. Recommendation, psych consult plus safe foster housing. Do you remember what happened to him? Helen nodded solemnly. He was with us for 3 months. I checked on him weekly. He never caused problems. Just sat, ate very little, kept a Bible under his pillow, but never read it in front of others. One morning he was gone. No signs of struggle, no note, nothing stolen. We assumed his ranch, but her voice broke slightly. I always wondered if we missed something. Braddock asked if police had been notified. Helen hesitated. That's the strange part. The center director at the time, Paul Shenley, said there was no need. He claimed the boy had been transferred, but we never saw any paperwork. When I pushed, he said, it's being handled privately. I let it go. I regret that. Braddock asked for details about Shenley. Helen replied, he wasn't like the others, kept to himself, very formal, spoke more like a priest than a social worker. That last statement triggered a memory for Braddock. She returned to the archived list of former St. Augustine staff. There it was. Paul Shenley had once gone by the name Brother Paulinus, listed as a monk and assistant administrator at St. Augustine from 1997 until early 2003. His record ended abruptly, no reason given. By 2004, he had re-emerged in Missouri under a civilian name and accepted a position at a youth shelter outside Springfield. The overlap was too significant to be coincidence. Braddock submitted a request to subpoena employment documents and internal records from the shelter for 2006. While waiting, she sent facial recognition analysts a snapshot of the 2004 Tim Ralke intake photo and requested cross-comparison with any known stills from 2006 shelter surveillance footage, if it existed. By the following week, Helen provided an additional detail. In her private notes from May 2006, she had scribbled something a coworker had said in passing. The mute kid, Shenley, spends a lot of time with him. At the time, it hadn't struck her as odd. Said he was working on restorative silence. It sounded Catholic to me. Braddock found the term in several monastic psychology journals. It was a practice used in cloistered environments to induce reflection and submission. Often controversial, sometimes misused. Braddock visited the site of the old shelter, now boarded up and under foreclosure. She entered with federal clearance and began searching the old office. Files had been removed, cabinets emptied, but one drawer, labeled Restricted, Admin Only, had a broken lock still intact. Inside was a thin manila folder marked TR/Private Notes. The pages were handwritten in tight cursive. First page, Patient, resists naming origin, shows signs of religious imprinting, frequent whispering in Latin, fragments of psalms, phrases associated with confession, claims God punished him for speaking. The second page included a more personal reflection by Shenley. Subject is becoming calm. Repetitive prayer stabilizes him. I believe the guilt keeps him here, but it's also what might save him. The implication was clear. Shenley believed the boy needed silence and submission to heal, yet he failed to report the disappearance when the teen vanished. Shenley was found living under his real name in southern Arkansas, working part-time at a local food bank. When approached, he denied knowledge of Thomas Rake, but confirmed he had run a shelter in Missouri. We had lots of boys, he said. Some came and went. Some stayed quiet. I don't remember that name. Braddock showed him the 2004 photo of Tim Ralke. He froze for just a moment too long. Doesn't ring a bell, he muttered. The FBI pressed forward with a formal interview. Shenley requested legal counsel and then declined further comment. However, Braddock had enough cause to request a full background audit. Inside a recovered external hard drive from Shenley's home, agents discovered a folder labeled. One page read, I watched the trees in Vermont. They were so tall I thought I could climb away from God. Another read, I am not who they say. My name is not the name they gave me. "I want to go home, but I don't remember how to speak to home anymore." The language was consistent with trauma, religious suppression, and long silence. Forensic handwriting analysts compared the writing to Thomas's school essays from 2002. Result: 89% match. The odds were narrowing. Braddock, now armed with testimony from Helen, artifacts from the shelter, and digital traces from Shenley's archives, suspected that Thomas, or someone using his identity, had survived into early adulthood, moved across facilities, and left behind small, desperate clues. After weeks of gathering fragments of Thomas's trail, from reform school records to old shelter testimonies, Special Agent Braddock decided it was time to bring Veronica Rake, Thomas's mother, directly into the fold. She invited her to the FBI field office in Burlington not just as a grieving parent, but now as a critical witness capable of affirming or refuting the true identity of the voice haunting the tapes. In a soundproofed interview room, Braddock placed a pair of noise-canceling headphones over Veronica's ears and dimmed the lights. She pressed play. The room filled with the faint hiss of static, then the fragile, wavering cadence of a young male voice reciting the Lord's Prayer in Latin. It stumbled on certain phrases, paused, resumed, but there was a tremor in the tone, a tension under the surface. Then came the whispered line, "Forgive me, I didn't mean to see it." Veronica's hands trembled as she clutched the headphones tighter. When the audio ended, Braddock sat quietly waiting. Veronica exhaled slowly and wiped her eyes. "That's him," she said, voice breaking. "That's my son's voice. But he wasn't praying. He was being made to say it, like he was reciting under pressure." She paused. He sounded afraid to say the wrong thing. Braddock nodded. "That's what our analysts suspect too." She handed Veronica a glass of water and carefully brought out a printed transcript of the audio. "We believe this was recorded around the time of his disappearance, but we may have just uncovered something else." She explained how the Bureau's audio forensics unit had recently enhanced the signal beneath the recording, the mechanical hum that lay buried in the background. With layered analysis, they had isolated an electrical pattern specific to a known cassette recorder model, the Roland M88, a device manufactured in the early 2000s and distributed in small quantities to educational institutions for student projects. What narrowed it down further was a serial number, a soft frequency imprint found on the calibration signal of the tape. Most commercial devices leave behind a trace signature, a kind of digital fingerprint burned into the low-frequency layer of every analog recording. When that serial was cross-referenced, it returned a single match, a Roland M88 listed as property of St. Augustine Monastic Academy, issued to the AV department in 2001 and reported missing on April 6, 2002, just 3 days before Thomas vanished. Braddock pulled the Academy's original inventory log from that year, retrieved via subpoena. The entry was brief but unmistakable. Device M88/serial 99,184/missing from AV cabinet/last signed out by E. Meeks. That name rang through Braddock's memory like a bell. Elijah Meeks, Thomas's roommate. The boy who first reported him missing, the one whose file had been marked emotionally unstable in the Academy's archived disciplinary notes. The same Meeks who had given statements back in 2002 but vanished from public records shortly after graduation. Braddock had assumed he'd move on with life, like most former students. Now she wasn't so sure. She tasked a team with tracking his current whereabouts. Meanwhile, the FBI conducted a sweep of old AV storage rooms at the Academy itself. In a sealed cabinet marked defective, agents discovered several out-of-use devices. Some were moldy, others rusted, but one, kept in a plastic bag and marked with a masking tape label reading, "Matched the missing device's serial number." Strangely, the device had been in storage the entire time, but the label claiming it was inoperable had been added recently, based on the freshness of the ink and adhesive residue. Forensic examination revealed that it was still functional. Whoever had labeled it had done so to mislead. Back at the lab, the tech team analyzed the internal tape heads for residue. What they found was consistent with the brand and type of cassette sent to the station in 2021. The timing was impossible to ignore. The machine had never truly gone missing. It had been hidden, quietly mislabeled, possibly even used again years later to generate the second tape sent to the station in 2021. Braddock suspected that someone with access had re-entered the property after the fact, possibly even a former staff member or student. The question now was who and why. Veronica, upon hearing all of this, sat in stunned silence. So he was there, in that school, after the day they said he was gone. Braddock nodded. We believe he never left the premises, not immediately. Veronica gripped the photo of her son tighter, the same one she had carried every day since April 2002. They lied. They all lied. The investigation widened. Braddock contacted the state's Department of Historical Education, requesting access to renovation records for St. Augustine dated from 2001 to 2005. A contractor file revealed that limited, undocumented work had been performed on the chapel sub-basement during spring 2002, plumbing rerouted, a wall partition erected, though no permits had been filed. It was, essentially, an unsanctioned structural modification. The blueprint sketch attached to the contractor's notes referenced isolation soundproofing in one section. Braddock's team returned to the site. After inspecting the lower level behind the east wing, they discovered a concealed entry behind a false bookshelf in the chapel's reliquary room. The door, jammed and rusted, opened after 30 minutes of effort. What lay behind it was a narrow passageway, unfinished, dirt walls roughly framed. At the end was a small room, no more than 10 feet across. It contained a single bench, 2 candle holders, and faint writing scratched into the concrete slab floor. I did not consent. I remember my name. Forensic teams began scouring the saxels, but age and moisture had degraded the samples. Still, swabs were taken and samples cross-collected against Thomas's known DNA from personal items his mother still kept, an old toothbrush, a baby tooth saved in a box. Results were pending. Braddock called Veronica 2 nights later. She didn't sugarcoat it. There's a chance your son was held in that space. We can't confirm for how long, but what he experienced there was not voluntary. Veronica wept quietly. He tried to tell me. All those nights, I dreamed of him calling out. Braddock placed a hand on her shoulder. You weren't wrong. He did call out. And now we're finally starting to listen. But there was one more thing. The signature of the technician who had labeled the device NOP months earlier matched the handwriting of an anonymous letter the FBI had received in 2015. A letter that warned, he's not gone, he's just been erased. That letter, previously dismissed as conspiracy, now took on new meaning. The handwriting analysis linked both documents to one person, a former seminary student who had briefly volunteered in the school's AV room during 22. Following the rediscovery of the hidden AV equipment and the realization that someone within the school's walls had deliberately mislabeled and concealed evidence for nearly 2 decades, Agent Braddock and her team intensified efforts to locate the individuals closest to the core of the cover-up. Of particular interest remained Father Thomas Bell, the former Bible studies teacher whose sudden departure 2 weeks after Thomas Rake's disappearances had raised suspicions from the beginning. His name had long vanished from public records, but a breakthrough came when a junior analyst in the Bureau's data mining division filed referenced historical employment data with medical insurance records filed under Catholic-affiliated care facilities. A Thomas Benjamin Allen, born within the same year as Bell, was listed as a patient at St. Hildegard's Assisted Living Community in rural Indiana. The listed occupation prior to retirement was religious educator. When Braddock saw the file, she knew immediately. It had to be him. She coordinated with local agents and arrived at St. Hildegard's unannounced. The facility was modest, quiet, nestled between a cluster of evergreens and the faded remnants of a rosary garden. Bell, now in his late 70s, was frailer than the photo in the 2001 class picture, but his eyes remained sharp. "Do you recognize this boy?" she asked. Bell's gaze lingered on the photo for several seconds. Then, almost inaudibly, he muttered, "I hoped I would never see that face again." Braddock took a deep breath. "Mr. Renard, or should I say Father Bell, we have reason to believe you were involved in concealing the whereabouts of Thomas Rake after April 2002. Bell said nothing for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I didn't harm him," he whispered. "I never touched him, but I didn't protect him either. I failed him in every way that mattered." Over the next several hours, under recorded interview conditions and in the presence of legal counsel, Bell confessed to hiding Thomas away in the subchapel chamber after the boy discovered what he called inappropriate conduct involving a senior clergy member and another student. Thomas had allegedly threatened to go to the bishop. Bell, fearing scandal and deeply indoctrinated into the institution's culture of secrecy, claimed he was told by another brother to manage the risk. "I could lock him down there," Bell said. "Just for a few nights, just until the brothers could figure out what to do." But then the decision was made to transfer him away. He claimed Thomas was sedated and moved out under the cover of night to a Catholic behavioral home in Missouri, believed to be St. Michael's Reclamation Camp. Bell insisted he was told the boy would be re-educated and eventually released. "But I think now that was a lie," he whispered, eyes glistening. They didn't want him to speak. Not ever again. Armed with this confession, Braddock coordinated with local authorities in Missouri to investigate the grounds adjacent to the now-defunct Perform Camp. Specifically, attention turned to a neglected field behind the old infirmary building, overgrown, rarely disturbed, and often used in the past for makeshift burials. Cadaver dogs were brought in. After hours of searching, one alerted at a shallow depression near an old tree line. Forensics exhumed a deteriorated coffin, no plaque, no burial record. Their dental records were inconclusive due to decay, but DNA was extracted from a molar. Veronica Rake was contacted. She had preserved several DNA-reliable items from Thomas's childhood, including a lock of hair and old baby teeth. Results came in 5 days later. A match, 99.9%. The boy in the unmarked grave was Thomas Rake. The confirmation hit Veronica with both the finality she had feared and the closure she desperately needed. "Now," she said through tears, "he's not lost anymore." A funeral was arranged in Vermont, attended by dozens of people who had followed the story for years. Former classmates, journalists, agents, and townspeople stood beside Veronica as she laid her son to rest, this time with a name, a headstone, and the truth finally emerging from years of darkness. Bell was arrested and charged with conspiracy to conceal a missing person, obstruction of justice, and negligent endangerment. Due to his age and deteriorating health, his trial was expedited. In court, he spoke briefly. "I was weak," he said. "I was a coward. I let a child be taken because I was afraid of what the truth would do to the church. I see now the church I served was never worthy of that loyalty." Other indictments followed. Elijah Meeks, tracked down in Arizona, admitted under immunity that he had been told to remove the cassette recorder from the AV room and to destroy any footage of Thomas's final days at the academy. He had kept the machine hidden in guilt and, years later, anonymously mailed the cassettes to WNVR, hoping someone would care enough to look deeper. The church publicly apologized, releasing a statement expressing deep sorrow for institutional failures and moral negligence, and pledged to cooperate fully with future inquiries. Yet for many, the apology came too late. Too many boys like Thomas had vanished in similar ways. Too many voices had been silenced by fear, tradition, and blind obedience. Veronica founded a non-net in her son's name, the Thomas Rake Foundation, dedicated to uncovering abuse in religious institutions and supporting families of missing children. In her speeches, she rarely spoke of vengeance. She spoke of silence. "It wasn't the night that took my son," she would say. "It was the silence that followed, silence built by adults who were too afraid to speak. We break that silence now, and we don't ever let it return." If this story left you thinking or feeling something, don't forget to like and subscribe for more real-life inscribed mysteries. What part of Thomas Rake's story struck you the most? Do you think justice was truly served? Let us know in the comments. And while you're there, tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from viewers all over.